He thought he'd lost his twin daughters, forever believed they were gone. But 3 years later, on a dusty bus, he heard their voices singing, alive, and worlds away from the pain he carried. What he discovered that day shattered more than just his heart. It broke his whole life before the story even began. Where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below. If these stories move you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, settle in. This is a story you won't forget. The morning air was sharp with a chill that bit not at the skin but deep into the bones, the kind of cold that made even the hardest edges of the town seem brittle. I remember the wind that day as if it were a living thing. It scraped against the cracked wooden boards beneath my feet, whispered its bitter secrets through the rattling window panes of the trading post, and wound its way around the boots and buckles of the crowd gathering in the town square. It was a wind filled with cruelty, as if the world itself had taken a breath and decided to let out all its grievances in one cold gust. The square was crowded, but no one seemed to meet each other's eyes. There was too much shame here, and shame makes people look away. It was early, but the sun had already climbed high enough to cast long shadows behind the faces of the men and women who had come to watch. Some were drawn by curiosity, others by something darker, a morbid interest in another's misfortune. Children had been hurried inside, and the older folks muttered warnings under their breath. No one wanted to be the one who looked too hard, who saw too much. At the center of it all stood a platform hastily built from split planks and old feed crates. It was a grim stage for what was to come. My husband stood there, swaying slightly as if the ground beneath him might tilt and throw him off balance at any moment. His breath smelled of cheap whiskey and regret. The paper sign nailed to a stick in his hand was scrawled roughly in uneven letters, but its message was clear. $1 for the pair. The crowd had gathered slow, like flies to something rotting, buzzing with hushed whispers and the occasional cough. I stood beside him, my hands bound behind my back with coarse twine that bit into my wrists. The small boy clung to my dress, his dirty cheeks flushed with cold, eyes wide and searching. He was only 5, barely taller than my hip, and he wore no shoes. The boy was silent, watching, unsure of what to make of the strange gathering. But I did not cry. I did not scream. I could not. There was something heavier than fear weighing me down, a crushing sense of numbness that had settled deep inside my chest. The bones of the child in my belly pressed tightly under the fabric of my worn dress, reminding me that life continued despite everything. The man with the sign called out to the crowd, his voice loud and cruel. "Sturdy woman," he laughed, showing his rotten teeth, "can cook, can clean, and give you another brat soon enough. Hell, might even get twins. I've had my fill." His laughter echoed off the dusty walls, but no one joined him. One old man spat on the ground and muttered, "Too quiet. Ain't this against the law?" A voice behind him, low and bitter, answered, "Ain't no law around here worth a damn, not for folks like her." I watched the crowd shift, the men's eyes darting away, avoiding my gaze, avoiding the shame they would have to carry if they looked too long. Then, as if cut from the cold wind itself, a figure appeared at the edge of the square. Tall but thin, the man wore a long coat patched in places, boots cleaned though worn. He didn't call out, didn't shove through the crowd. He simply stood, hat pulled low, hands resting calmly at his sides. He was watching me. Our eyes met for a single brief second, and in that instant, something inside me stirred. I did not flinch. The drunk husband kept shouting, pushing me forward like I was nothing but a broken thing to be traded. "You'll find no better deal. She don't talk back, don't ask nothing. Hell, she's yours to name." Then the quiet man stepped forward. His boot touched the platform's edge. He didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I'll take her." The man on the platform blinked, stunned. "The woman and the boy?" "I'll take them both. $2. There was a silence that fell like a stone in a well cold, absolute. The crowd held its breath. The drunk looked him over, eyes narrowing. "Get off my crate!" The quiet man reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in a rough cloth. He unfolded it slowly. Inside were 3 silver coins and a gold wedding band. "This is what I have." The husband's eyes gleamed with greed. He snatched the ring quickly. "Deal," he said too fast. I said nothing. I only stared at the man with the worn coat, as if trying to see his soul through the shape of his collarbones. He didn't reach for me. He didn't touch my boy. He simply turned and began walking away. We followed him silently. No cheers. No applause. Only the wind, cold, relentless, moving behind us, lifting dust from the dirt road. The wagon was simple. Nothing more than 2 old blankets spread in the back and a chipped canteen tied to the side. The man helped the boy climb up first, then nodded for me to follow. I paused for a moment, one hand gripping the edge of the wagon. "Why?" I asked, voice low. He didn't look at me. "Didn't feel right leaving you there?" That was all. The road out of town was long and mostly uphill. Trees gave way to open land, crusted with the last patches of snow at the edges. No one spoke. The boy watched the clouds, tracing patterns in the pale sky. I cradled my belly like a secret, feeling the quiet movements inside me. We stopped once, letting the horses rest. I leaned against the sideboard, catching my breath. "You got a name?" I finally asked. He nodded, but didn't say it. After a pause, he said, "You can stay the night. Just the night. Then we'll see." I nodded. That was fair. At dusk, we reached the cabin. It wasn't much a roof, a door, smoke curling lazily from the chimney like it had forgotten how to be fire. He carried the boy inside and set him near the stove, where red coals whispered their warmth. I hesitated on the porch. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "No wife?" A pause. "Once." I stepped inside, my boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. He pointed to the cot. "You take the bed. He'll stay warm by the stove. What about you?" "I'll sleep by the door." I looked at him, long and steady. "You don't have to do this." "I know." He didn't take off his coat, just sat down, back against the wall, one knee drawn up, hat tilted low. I tucked my son in and sat beside him. The boy curled into my chest, thumb in his mouth. The fire cracked softly, like it remembered something long forgotten. The first night was heavy with silence. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that presses on your chest, reminding you that you're still breathing, still alive, still waiting. I woke in the dark to a dull ache, not labor pains, not yet, just the ache of finally being somewhere safe. I found him sitting just as he had been when I went to sleep, eyes distant. "Tent sleep?" He shrugged. "You some kind of preacher?" "No." "Then why do you do it?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Lost my wife a year ago. Fever." He shifted, like the memory weighed too much to carry. "Used to think I'd earned that kind of pain. Maybe I deserve to sit with it. But watching you on that crate today." He stopped. I waited. He didn't finish. Instead, he said, "There's coffee if you want it." I shook my head. "You ever want anything from me, it won't be like that man in town. I'd rather freeze." He didn't flinch. "I ain't that man." "You say that now?" He looked at me, then really looked. "You don't have to trust me. Not yet. Just stay the night. That's all." I nodded. "All right." Back in bed, I curled around my son. The fire had died down to a soft breath in the darkness. My voice rose once more, a whisper into the quiet. "My name's not important. Not yet. But I remember yours." He didn't turn. I smiled into the pillow. "I saw it on the wedding band." Silence. He chuckled once. "Quiet like dust lifting." "Guess I'll have to change the engraving then." I didn't answer, but my eyes stayed open a long while, watching the glow of safety trace itself across the ceiling like moonlight. And far off, beyond the trees, a wolf howled once and was not answered. The dawn crept slowly over the hills, soft light spilling like spilled milk across the rough edges of the cabin's weathered roof. I lay awake longer than I wanted, listening to the quiet breathing of the man and the boy beside me, the occasional creak of the wood as the cabin settled into the morning. Outside, the wind had softened. It no longer bit like it had the day before, but it still whispered secrets only the trees could understand. I was afraid to speak, afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled between us. The past clung to me like a second skin, a skin raw and bruised from years of pain and silence. I had never told anyone the whole story, not like this, not with words laid bare. Yet somehow, being here in this place with him made me want to try. He stirred, sitting up slowly, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders despite the warmth of the day. His eyes, still heavy with the shadows of grief, met mine without a word. There was something in that look, a silent understanding, a promise perhaps, that we were both haunted but no longer alone. I traced the line of my belly, feeling the steady movements of the child growing inside. The baby was still a secret, held tightly beneath worn fabric and whispered hopes. The small boy beside me, fragile and dirt-streaked, was the only other living piece of my fractured life. Everything else, my husband's rage, the broken home, the long nights of tears, felt like a distant nightmare, one I feared waking from only to find reality worse. "Do you want to tell me where you come from?" His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if afraid that the past was too heavy to carry. I swallowed the lump in my throat and began. "I was 17 when I married him. My father called it a good match, strong stock," he said, "but I knew. I knew from the first day that the man I married was not the man I needed. He was cold, distant, and angry. Not the kind of anger that bursts like fire, but the kind that slowly hardens into ice, freezing everything it touches. I thought if I bore his children, fed his anger with silence, he might soften. But anger doesn't soften. It hardens. It spreads like poison through the bones of a family. The second child never made it. The day I bled on the floor of that house, the day the door slammed against my stomach, I knew the place I called home had become a prison. He blamed me for being weak. I blamed myself for not running sooner. But the quiet man listened without judgment, nodding slowly, letting me say the things I'd buried deep inside. I didn't need to explain the scars or the bruises, they were already there in my silence. "I was terrified when he put that sign around my neck," I said, voice shaking. "Not because I feared being bought, but because I feared no one would." He looked at me then, and something softened in his eyes. "You were never something to be bought." I didn't believe him then, not until this place. Not until I saw how different things could be. The wind moved through the dry branches outside, as if it knew we were speaking truths too long hidden. Days passed slowly after that first night. The man, who I learned was called P, did not ask many questions. He didn't pry into my past, didn't push me to speak when I was not ready. Instead, he worked around the cabin chopping wood, repairing the roof, keeping the fire alive. The rhythm of his work was steady and calm, like a prayer said without words. I found myself humming old lullabies I hadn't thought of in years. Songs my mother sang when the stars were kind and the world seemed less cruel. The boy smiled when I sang, a small light in the shadow that had fallen over all of us. One evening, the boy asked for a story. To my surprise, P told one about a fox and a crow, a story that didn't make much sense, but made the boy laugh. It was the first time I saw him relax, the first time I felt a fragile hope begin to bloom inside me. But even as we found moments of peace, the past refused to stay buried. One morning, a storm rolled over the hills. Thunder cracked the sky like a warning, and the boy clung to my side, frightened. I couldn't sleep that night, neither could P. We sat across the room, fire crackling between us. "Do you ever think this cabin holds its breath?" I asked him softly. He tilted his head, thinking, maybe it's waiting for something, or someone. I wanted to believe that the cabin was waiting for us to heal, waiting for the laughter of children and the soft glow of hope to fill its walls once more. But the past was not so easily left behind. Word came one day from a neighbor, a red-faced man, clutching a letter from the sheriff's office. "The boy's father has made a complaint," the man said, voice low and hesitant. "Says he's been robbed. Says the woman has no legal standing to keep the boy or the newborn." I froze. The air left my lungs. They want to take him, I whispered. P stood firm. His voice was calm but carried the weight of iron. They'll take no one from this house, not while I breathe. The neighbors left, ashamed and quiet, but the threat lingered in the air like a dark cloud. That night, I packed my things. Quietly, carefully. I wasn't going to let them tear my boy from safety. When I stepped outside, bag in hand, P was already there. You're leaving, he said softly. I have to, I replied. If I'm gone, maybe they won't touch him. Maybe you can say you're his guardian. He stepped closer, pulling a small braid of silver and worn wood shaped into a ring from his pocket. I was waiting, he said. My heart stopped. I know it ain't the way most men propose, he said, voice low. But I'm not most men. And you're not just someone I care for. You're the storm in the sky after. You're the reason I remember how to pray. I stared at the ring, disbelief and hope warring inside me. You'd marry me just to save us? I'd marry you because I already belong to you. Behind me, the boy's voice called out, Ma. I turned to see him holding his little wooden horse, watching with wide eyes. Pete knelt beside him. What do you think, son? Can I be your paw for real? The boy didn't answer. He just ran into P's arms. And just like that, I let the bag fall from my fingers. He didn't speak. I didn't have to. The next day, we rode into town. The clerk signed the certificate with a bored hand. No one questioned it. Later, in the churchyard, Pete draped his mother's shawl over my shoulders. It wasn't white, but it was clean. It wasn't new, but it was warm. No crowd. No bells. But when we stepped back onto the porch that night, the boy clapped and called it the best day of his life. He wept into my hands. He didn't ask why. The cabin began to change. The garden thawed. Potatoes were planted in silence, side by side. The boy painted the shutters red. For the first time in years, the house looked like someone lived there on purpose. One evening, while chopping wood, P paused, listening. I followed him inside where the girl's laughter bubbled pure and bright. She was small, but not broken. I whispered into the dark, You healed something I didn't know could be healed. He replied softly, You did the same for me. Outside, the crocus bloomed in the moonlight. Inside, 3 hearts beat in quiet rhythm. The cold air had started to loosen its grip. Snow melted into mud beneath the boots, and the days stretched longer. The world outside the cabin was waking up from its long winter sleep. But inside, the slow pulse of life was barely changing. I often caught myself staring out the small window, watching how the shadows moved over the hills, wondering if the past was truly behind User, if it just waited patiently to crash back in like a storm. The boy grew stronger, his laughter more frequent, but there was still a quiet sadness in his eyes. He was a child too young to understand everything but old enough to feel the weight of silence pressing down around us. I watched how P looked at him, this strange man who had stepped out of nowhere and claimed us both with nothing but coins and a quiet promise. There was tenderness in those moments, subtle and rare, but it existed. Our days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, warming the stove, coaxing steam from the kettle. I began to learn the contours of this place, how the shadows fell in the late afternoon, how the wind sounded when it slipped through the trees. And slowly, I learned the man's routines, the habits that filled the spaces where words often failed. One evening, as the sun bled out into streaks of red and gold, I found P sitting on the porch, his coat wrapped tightly around him despite the mild air. His eyes were distant, watching the horizon as if he was searching for something lost. I settled beside him without a word, letting the silence stretch between us like a fragile thread. After a long moment, he spoke in that low, gravelly voice. Do you ever wonder what comes after all this? His question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability I heard beneath the rough edge. I used to think there was no after, I said quietly. Just more nights like those in that town square. More pain, more silence. He nodded slowly, the flicker of a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Me too. I thought the past was a chain I'd never break. We were both prisoners in our own weishi of memories too painful to forget. I have scars too deep to heal easily. But here, in this small cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and cold earth, something was beginning to loosen inside us. Maybe it was the safety, or maybe it was the boys' laughter echoing through the walls, but the weight of silence wasn't as suffocating anymore. The baby grew restless inside me, kicking hard enough to steal my breath. Every movement reminded me of the life we were bringing into this fragile world. The memory of loss lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake, but alongside it bloomed a stubborn hope. This child was a Chansian unspoken promise that even broken things could find a way to heal. One cold night, I woke to the ache of labor. The pain was sharp but steady, a reminder that life's hardest battles often come wrapped in quiet moments. P was there, calm and steady, though I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. This was new territory for him, just as it was for me. He moved with a careful grace I hadn't expected, fetching water, tending the fire, never once letting me feel alone. The boy stayed close, wide-eyed and silent, sensing the importance of the moment without understanding it. When the baby finally came small and trembling but alive, there was no celebration, no joyful cries, just the soft, miraculous sound of new life breathing in the cold cabin air. I looked down at her, fragile and perfect, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. P held her first, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He didn't smile or speak, just stared, as if trying to memorize every inch of this tiny new world. The boy reached out, touching her foot with the reverence of a sacred offering. We didn't need words. The silence between us was filled with a new kind of love, quiet, steady, unbreakable. But peace is never easy when the past refuses to rest. The sheriff's letter had been a warning, but the threat soon became real. One bitter morning, two men arrived at the cabin, their boots sinking into the thawing mud. They wore wool coats and carried papers that smelled of authority and cold indifference. I watched from the window as they approached, my heart pounding like a drum. P met them at the door, his voice calm but fierce. "This is my land," he said simply, "and you will not take what belongs here." They showed the papers claims from the boy's father, demands to remove us from the property. But P's presence was a wall none could breach. The men left without violence, but with a warning in their eyes that chilled me more than any winter wind. That night, the weight of fear settled over us like a heavy fog. I watched P carefully, seeing the tension he tried to hide behind stoic silence. The boy clung to me, sensing the storm that raged beneath the surface. "We won't let them take you," P promised, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm scared," I admitted, tears burning behind my eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and you're not alone anymore." Days turned to weeks, and the cabin became a sanctuary not just of shelter, but of resilience. The baby's cries filled the rooms, a melody of life and hope. The boy ran through the woods with newfound energy, his laughter a balm to wounds unseen. We planted a garden: potatoes, carrots, wildflowers, small signs of growth in the harsh soil. I carved a cradle for the baby, staining it with oil and care, each stroke a prayer for safety and love. P built shelves, fixed the roof, and quietly mended the broken parts of this makeshift family. We never spoke much about the past, but sometimes our eyes met, sharing the unspoken truths we carried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, I found him sitting by the fire, carving a small wooden horse. "The boy's been naming things," he said softly. "Says this one should be for him." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. In that moment, surrounded by the crackling fire and the quiet hum of life, I knew we were building something real, something worth fighting for. The first spring after the long winter was slow to arrive. The icicles lost their daggers, puddles formed where the boy's boot prints pressed into the thawing earth. The sky softened from harsh gray to a gentler blue, and birds began to return one at a time. like scouts uncertain if this place was safe. Inside the cabin, the baby's cries became laughter, her fragile body growing stronger each day. The boy doted over her, proud to share her name, brother and protector in one. Neighbors began to notice the changes not through gossip or whispers, but through the quiet strength radiating from this place. The house looked lived in, painted with fresh colors and filled with sounds of life. One teacher remarked quietly, "Your boy told us he has two parents now." Peace smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. "He says his paw smells like pine and smiles when nobody's looking." I laughed, feeling a joy I thought had been lost forever. But the past never fully lets go. One day, the letter came again. The law was coming, they said. They were coming to take the children, to tear apart the fragile family we had built. Fear gripped me like a vice. I packed my things again, not knowing if this time I would be able to stay. But P was there, steady and unyielding. "You're not alone," he said. "This is your home now." And for the first time, I believed him. The story was far from over, but for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Because love, I learned, was not a quiet thing. It was a storm, and the sky after. The silence of the cabin was deceptive. It was never truly quiet, not with 3 lives intertwining within its walls. The soft breaths of the sleeping baby, the boy's gentle snores from the cot, and the faint crackling of the dying fire all wove together into a fragile harmony. But outside, the shadows of the past were gathering, creeping closer like the coming dusk. P's eyes, usually so steady and unreadable, flickered with unrest. I caught him staring long into the night, as if searching for ghosts only he could see. The weight he carried was invisible to the world, but I saw etched into the lines of his hands, in the way his shoulders tensed when he thought I wasn't watching. We had found a fragile peace here, far from the town's cruel eyes and the husband's betrayal. Yet peace was a thread stretched thin, ready to snap. One evening, the boy came running into the cabin, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes wide with alarm. "Mom," he whispered, voice trembling. "There's someone outside, watching." My heart stopped for a moment, pounding so loudly I feared it might echo through the walls. I exchanged a glance with P, whose hand instinctively rested on the old rifle propped near the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "I'll check." Minutes later, the porch creaked beneath his boots as he stepped outside. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. I watched him move slowly toward the tree line, senses sharp and ready. When he returned, his face was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. "We're not alone," he said simply. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, heart hammering against my ribs, mind spinning with fears I could barely name. The past wasn't finished with us. It was coming back like a storm ready to tear down everything we'd fought to build. The days that followed were a blur of whispered warnings and hushed conversations. P fortified the cabin, repairing weak spots and setting traps around the perimeter. The boy watched with a mixture of awe and fear, too young to understand but old enough to sense the growing danger. The baby's cries became more frequent, as if sensing the tension in the air. I held her close, rocking her in my arms, whispering promises of safety I wasn't sure I could keep. One afternoon, as the sun struggled through a sky thick with clouds, a distant rumble shattered the fragile calm. Horses thundered through the mud, their riders cloaked in dark coats and grim expressions. The sheriff and his deputies had come. They rode up without ceremony, their eyes scanning the cabin and its inhabitants with suspicion. The boy clung to my skirt, while P stood tall, a silent guardian. The sheriff dismounted, paper in hand, voice cold and official. "This property is under investigation," he said. "Claims have been made regarding the custody of the children." I swallowed hard, fear coiling in my stomach like a serpent. "We belong here," P said firmly. "No one is taking them." The deputies exchanged glances but said nothing more. The sheriff's eyes lingered on the baby, then on the boy, and finally on me. A faint trace of doubt flickered across his face, but duty was a rigid mask. "We will be back," he warned. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of uncertainty. I watched P move about, restless and tense, the man I thought I knew slipping away behind a mask of determination. I wanted to ask him what he feared most. Was it the law, the past, or the possibility of losing the fragile family we'd forged? But words felt heavy, too dangerous. Instead, I sat by the fire, the baby asleep on my chest, and stared into the flickering flames. I thought of the life we'd left behind, the betrayals and losses etched into my skin, and the man beside me who had rescued me not with grand gestures, but with quiet strength. In the stillness, I made a promise to fight, to protect, to never let the past define us again. Days bled into weeks, each moment charged with tension and hope. The garden bloomed slowly, stubborn and resilient, a mirror of our own survival. The boy grew bolder, chasing birds through the trees, laughter ringing out like a balm to my weary soul. P and I found moments of quiet between the storm-shared glances, silent understandings, and the soft touch of hands seeking reassurance. One evening, under a sky heavy with stars, I found myself opening up for the first time in months. "I'm scared," I whispered. "Not just of what's coming, but of losing what we've built." He took my hand, his touch steady and warm. "You're not alone," he said, "and neither am I." For a moment, the past faded away, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could heal. But the past never truly dies. One bitter dawn, a messenger arrived with news that shattered the fragile peace. The boy's father had returned to town, rallying old allies and stirring trouble. The threats grew louder, the danger closer. Fear clenched my heart like a vice, but I refused to let it break me. We would fight for the children, for the family, for the future we dared to believe in. The cabin stood strong against the coming storm, a beacon of love and defiance in a world determined to tear us apart. And as the snow began to fall once more, soft and relentless, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. Because family wasn't just blood. It was the bond forged in pain, in hope, and in the unbreakable will to survive. The snow settled like a cold shroud over the land, softening the sharp edges of the world, but never dulling the chill beneath. Inside the cabin, the fire struggled to keep the biting cold at bay, casting long, flickering shadows against the worn wooden walls. It was in these moments of silence, surrounded by the quiet breathing of my children and the low hum of the stove, that the weight of what was coming felt heaviest. I caught P staring out the frost-laced window more often these days, his eyes tracing the skeletal outlines of the leafless trees beyond the clearing, as if reading some silent message in the barren branches. The man who had saved us was no stranger to hardship, but even he seemed to be wrestling with the ghosts of the past. The boy, unaware of the dark clouds gathering beyond his world, spent his days chasing the first fragile signs of spring, finding stubborn crocuses breaking through the snow, skimming stones on the slow-moving creek, and watching the birds as they returned one by one. His laughter was a balm to my soul, a fleeting promise that life could still be gentle. And the baby me little miracle grew stronger with each passing day, her fragile cries blossoming into soft coos and tentative smiles. Her presence was a thread of light in the darkness that had once engulfed me, a reason to fight beyond survival. But the law was coming. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant ridge and the sky bled red, a low rumble echoed through the valley horse's hooves, pounding through the snow, kicking up mud and leaves. The boy's face paled as he ran to the door, clutching my hand tightly. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. P's jaw clenched, and I saw the fire ignite in his eyes, an ember of defiance that would not be easily extinguished. The sheriff and his deputies arrived without fanfare, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. They wore the cold authority of the law, like armor, but their eyes betrayed something less certain beneath the official facade. "We have orders," the sheriff said, voice as sharp as the winter wind, "to investigate the custody of the children." I stood tall despite the cold sinking into my bones, cradling the baby close to my chest. P's hand rested protectively on the rifle leaned against the wall, his stance steady and unyielding. "You'll find no reason to take them," he said, voice low but firm. "This is their home." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but the sheriff's gaze lingered on the baby before nodding curtly. "We will be back," he warned. That night, the cabin held its breath. The flames flickered low as exhaustion weighed down my limbs, but sleep was elusive. I lay awake, listening to the slow rhythm of my children's breathing, the silence punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The boy's small hand found mine in the dark. "Will they take us?" he asked, eyes wide and searching. I squeezed his hand gently. "No one's taking you." But even as I spoke the words, doubt gnawed at my heart. Days passed in a tense, fragile balance. P fortified the cabin, repairing the worn steps, reinforcing the door, and setting traps around the perimeter. The boy watched with wide eyes, absorbing the weight of the world in ways only children can half understanding, half trusting the grown-ups to keep the darkness at bay. The baby's cries grew more frequent, as if she sensed the unease swirling through the air, a mirror to the storm gathering beyond the tree line. In stolen moments, P and I would share quiet looks, brief touches that spoke of unspoken fears and fragile hope. Neither of us could say what the future held, but both of us were anchored to this small family we had fought so hard to protect. Then came the news. A messenger arrived on a weary horse, clutching a sealed letter, stamped with the harsh emblem of the county court. The boy's father, the man who had sold me like cattle had, returned to town, stirring old grudges and enlisting new allies. The legal papers threatened to rip the fragile threads of our family apart. Fear clenched my heart like a vice, but I refused to let it break me. We had come too far, survived too much, to let the past steal away what little light we had left. One cold morning, under a sky heavy with low clouds, P gathered the neighbors who had slowly started to trust us farmers, tradesmen, and a few wary loners who understood what it meant to protect what they loved. Together we planned. The cabin would become a fortress, not just of wood and stone, but of unyielding will. The neighbors brought Supplius extra firewood, sturdy nails, tools. Some offered to keep watch, others volunteered to bring food and news from the town. The boy ran among them, eyes bright with the unfamiliar warmth of belonging. That night, as snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, P and I sat by the fire, hands intertwined, the baby sleeping peacefully between us. "Do you think we'll make it?" I whispered. He looked at me, eyes steady and sure. "We don't have a choice. We will." The flames danced in his gaze, a reflection of the fierce determination that had saved us once and would have to save us again. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a coming storm. But inside the cabin, against all odds, a family held fast-bound not by blood, but by love, by courage, and by the unbreakable hope of a new beginning. The days grew longer, but the shadow of fear still lingered heavy over the valley. Snow melted slowly under the uncertain warmth of early spring, revealing patches of muddy earth and tangled roots beneath the trees. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a fragile island in a sea of watchful eyes and whispered rumors. I watched the boy running barefoot across the clearing, his laughter ringing out like a rare song in the quiet wilderness. His energy was boundless, fueled by the innocence of childhood and the growing security that P and I had built around him. The baby, now nearly 3 months old, slept peacefully in the cradle carved from pine-her tiny fingers, curling around a scrap of cloth as if clutching onto life itself. But beneath the surface of this fragile piece, tension simmered. The law was patient. It did not need to strike swiftly to break us. It only needed to wait. One afternoon, as I tended the small garden we had coaxed from the stubborn earth, P rode into the clearing with a grim expression. His horse's hooves thudded heavily against the soft soil. sending birds scattering into the sky. The boy ran to meet him, eyes shining with hope and trust. But P's smile did not reach his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, dismounting slowly and brushing the dirt from his coat. I wiped my hands on my apron, heart tightening. "They're planning another visit," he continued, voice low and steady. "Stronger this time, more than just a simple check." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The sheriff's warnings had been nothing but promises of escalating pressure. "We can't run forever," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "But we don't have to face them alone." That evening, we gathered with the neighbors, again older men with weathered faces, women who had endured their own battles, and even some of the younger boys who had grown up in the valley and understood the unspoken code of protecting one another. The plan was simple but dangerous. We would stand our ground, united. If the law came to take my children, they would have to face more than just one family's defiance. As the firelight flickered against the faces around me, I felt a surge of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time: hope. But hope is a fragile thing. The night before the lawmen arrived, the wind shifted. A storm rolled over the hills, dark clouds swallowing the stars and turning the world to shadows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl warning of the coming tempest. Inside the cabin, the baby whimpered in her sleep. The boy clung to my side, eyes wide and restless. P stood by the door, rifle in hand, his silhouette steady and unwavering against the roaring storm outside. I held my children close, whispering promises I hoped to keep. When the knock came, it was not soft. It was the hammer of fate, pounding on our fragile sanctuary. The sheriff and his men stood in the pouring rain, faces hard and eyes cold. They were armed with more than just papers this time, steel and orders, backed by a law that cared little for mercy or justice. "You have 24 hours to surrender the children," the sheriff said, voice slicing through the storm like a blade. "Failure to comply will be met with force." I looked to P, whose jaw was set, eyes blazing with defiance. "We don't surrender," he said simply. The night was a battleground of wills. We fortified the cabin, barricading doors and windows. Neighbors arrived under the cover of darkness, bringing what help they could: extra rifles, food, and unwavering resolve. The boy hid beneath the blankets, clutching his wooden horse as thunder crashed overhead. The baby cried, sensing the fear that filled the air. And I prayed for strength, for courage, for a miracle. Morning came broken and gray, the storm spent but the danger far from over. The lawmen circled the cabin like wolves, their patience thinning. Shots rang out sharp, sudden, and terrifying. P moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had faced death before. His aim was true, his heart fierce. The neighbors fought beside him, a ragged band of protectors defending what was theirs. I stayed inside with the children, my hands trembling as I held them close. Hours passed in a blur of noise and fear. When silence finally fell, it was broken only by the soft whimper of the baby and the boy's quiet sobs. The sheriff's men had retreated for now, but the cost was written in the blood-soaked earth and shattered wood. P's face was pale, his body bruised but unbroken. He sat beside me, pulling me into a fierce embrace. "We're not done," he whispered. In the days that followed, the valley held its breath. The neighbors kept watch, eyes sharp and hearts ready. The children grew, their laughter slowly returning to the cabin walls. And between P and me, a bond deep and tempered by fire, forged in struggle. We were more than survivors. We were family. But the past does not easily release its grip. Whispers from town grew louder, rumors fueled by fear and prejudice. The man who had once sold me like cattle had not forgotten. He sent men to the cabin, dark shadows lurking in the forest, watching, waiting. One night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside, soft but deliberate. P was already awake, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. The intruders retreated, but the message was clear. Our fight was far from over. As spring gave way to summer, the valley blossomed, but so did the threats. We learned to move quietly, to watch the shadows, to protect what we loved with every breath. The children thrived despite the dangerous innocent lights in a world grown dark. And in the quiet moments between battles, P and I dreamed of a future beyond fear. A home built not on survival, but on peace. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and sacrifice. But for the first time in a long time, I believed in tomorrow. Because love had found us in the darkest of places. Because family was not just blood or name, it was the courage to stand together against the storm. And we would stand. No matter what. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth. But beneath that promise of cleansing lay a weight I could not shake. The days following the last skirmish had been tense but quiet. Too quiet. P moved through the cabin with a careful grace, watching the edges of the forest like a predator guarding his territory. The boy had started to ask questions too many for a child who should be spared such shadows, but I could only offer half-truths, wrapped in stories about wild animals and the strength we all carry inside. The baby's soft coos were a balm, a fragile thread holding me together when the past threatened to unravel my soul. But peace is a fickle friend in places like these. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, I saw the smoke before I heard the screams. Flames tore through the trees like hungry beasts, casting a hellish glow over the valley. The neighbors' cabins, homes built from sweat and hope, were burning. We ran toward the chaos, hearts pounding with dread. P's voice cut through the smoke and noise, fierce and commanding. Get the children to safety? I'll hold them off. There was no time to argue. I wrapped the baby in a blanket and grabbed the boy's hand, running faster than I thought possible. Behind me, the crackling of fire and the shouts of men chasing destruction. Our sanctuary was under siege. We reached a hidden hollow beyond the ridge, a place P had found long ago, a secret refuge. The boy sobbed, clutching his wooden horse, his small body trembling. "Why are they doing this?" he asked, voice breaking. I had no answer, only a promise. We're safe here, for now. But safety was an illusion. When we returned under cover of darkness, the cabin lay in ruins, blackened beams, shattered glass, the bitter scent of loss hanging heavy. P's eyes burned with a fury I had never seen before. He knelt among the ashes, touching the remnants of the cradle, the toys, the quilts. "This is war," he said quietly, "and we will not lose." The next days were a blur of rebuilding and planning. The neighbors rallied, their quiet strength becoming a shield. But P and I knew the true battle was not just for survival, it was for the future of our children, for the right to live free from fear. One night, as the baby slept beside me, I felt the weight of everything crash down. The years of pain, loss, and heartache. The endless struggle against a world that seemed designed to break us. I wept silently, afraid to wake the boy or disturb the fragile peace. P came to me then, not with words but with a touch that said everything. We had both been broken, but together we could be whole again. The law returned, stronger this time, armed with mercenaries and threats. P gathered the neighbors, forming a militia of weary but determined souls. We set traps, hid in the trees, and fought with everything we had. Every day was a battle, every night a prayer. And then, one morning, the sheriff himself came to the cabin, face hardened like stone, eyes cold as winter. He spoke of orders from the governor, of laws and property, of rights and obedience. But P looked him in the eye and said, "You don't own us. You don't own her or those children." The sheriff sneered. But for the first time, I saw hesitation. The standoff stretched for days, neither side willing to back down. The valley held its breath. And in the quiet moments, I realized something. This fight was more than just about us. It was about every woman who had been sold, every child who had been taken, every soul crushed beneath the weight of cruelty. We were the spark. Then came the night when the unthinkable happened. The baby fell ill. A fever that burned hotter than the summer sun. P stayed by her side, his hands gentle and sure, whispering words of comfort. I held the boy close, Feeling the helplessness clawed my heart. We had no doctor, no medicine, only hope and love. As the fever raged, I saw something shift in P. The man who had once been haunted by loss became a guardian of life itself. He refused to leave her side, refusing to surrender to the darkness. And slowly, against all odds, the baby's breathing eased. The fever broke. She opened her eyes bright, fragile, alive. In that moment, I knew we had survived the worst. But the scars would remain, and the fight was far from over. The valley was changed forever, but so were we. And as dawn broke over the hills, I looked at P and knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. Because family is not just blood or name. It is the fire that refuses to be extinguished, the light that shines in the darkest night, and the courage to stand again and again for those you love. Morning light filtered softly through the cracked window panes of the cabin. The fire had long burned down to embers, casting a faint warmth into the room where the baby slept peacefully. For the first time in weeks, the air felt less heavy, less filled with fear. I watched P, still sitting by the stove, his eyes distant but calmer. The battle outside might have paused, but the war in our hearts was far from over. We had a fragile peace, and with it came new questions. Questions about the future, about safety, about hope. The boy stirred in his sleep, clutching his wooden horse. I touched his cheek gently. His innocence was a fragile treasure we all needed to protect. Today, I realized, was a new beginning. We had survived fire, loss, and threats. But now it was time to rebuild not only the cabin but our lives. To build a home, a place where the past shadows could no longer reach us. And for the first time, I dared to believe that love could be more than just survival. It could be a promise. Days folded into each other with a quiet rhythm, chopped wood, tending the fire. Soft lullabies whispered in the dark. The cabin grew warmer not just from the stove, but from something neither of us dared to name aloud: trust. But even as the baby's cries softened and the boy's laughter returned, shadows lingered at the edges of our world. The past had a stubborn way of clawing back. Whispers from the town came like distant thunder, reminders that we weren't truly free yet. I caught P staring at the horizon one evening, jaw tight, eyes stormy. I knew that look it was the weight of a man haunted by ghosts not yet laid to rest. "Will they come again?" I asked, though my voice trembled more than I wanted. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he drew a deep breath and said, "I fought before. I'll fight again." I saw then that this was no longer just about survival. It was about fighting for the life we were building, for the family we were becoming. In that moment, beneath the bruised sky, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the fiercest battles are not with others, but with the fears inside us. And sometimes, love itself is the fiercest fight of all. The nights grew longer, colder. The wind no longer whispered. Softly it howled like a beast, clawing at the fragile walls of our cabin, as if the past itself refused to be silenced. But inside, there was a fire that would not be snuffed out. Not by fear, not by pain, not by the cruel hands that once tried to break us. I watched P, the man who had become my shadow, my shield. He was no hero forged in shining armor. He was a man carved from scars, with eyes that held the weight of 1,000 lost battles. Yet, every time he looked at me or the children, there was a softness there, like a secret promise he carried deep inside. A promise of hope. The baby's small miracle had grown stronger. Her cries became songs. Her fingers curled around my own in ways that made my heart ache. And my boy, with his bright eyes and scraped knees, started to smile again. The laughter came back to our home, slow and cautious at first, then like a flood breaking through a dam. But the world outside the cabin's worn door was unforgiving. Rumors traveled faster than footsteps, and one chilly morning the sheriff's deputy came knocking. His gaze was hard, his words colder still. "We've had complaints," he said, voice clipped. "Your claim to these children is under question. The law." I didn't flinch. P stepped forward, tall and unyielding as a mountain. "This house is their home. No law will tear them from it while I draw breath." The deputy hesitated, seeing the unspoken storm in his eyes, and left with nothing but the sound of our defiant silence ringing in the cold air. That night, as the fire crackled low, I sat with the children close, feeling the fragile threads of our family weaving stronger. P told stories, not with words, but with presence steady, unshakable. He was no stranger to pain, but here, in this cabin, he was becoming something new, a guardian of broken things, a keeper of quiet hope. I realized then that healing is not a lightning strike, but a slow dawn. It is not forgetting what tore us apart, but choosing to build something beyond it. Love a real love does, not erase the scars. It makes them sacred. And as the first light of morning crept through the frost-lined windows, I understood that we had already won. Not because the world had changed, but because we had. We were no longer just survivors. We were a family. The first rays of dawn broke over the ridge, spilling gold across the weary landscape. The cold was still biting, but the air had softened as if the earth itself was exhaling after a long, harsh winter. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet of something sacred taking root. The baby, nestled against me, breathed softly, her tiny chest rising and falling like a promise. My boy sat nearby, tracing circles on the wooden floor, his eyes bright with the kind of hope that had once seemed impossible. P stood by the doorway, watching us with a gaze that no longer held shadows but light, the light of a man who had found something to live for beyond the ghosts that haunted him. His hands, once clenched tight against the world, now rested open, gentle. I thought back to the day the man in town had held that sign, selling me and my son like chattel, how raw and bitter that moment had been. How I'd thought that was the end of everything. But here we were, not broken, not beaten, not lost. We were alive. The scars inside me pulsed with every breath, memories of pain and loss threading through my veins. But they no longer defined me. They were the stitches holding the new me together, stronger, wiser, capable of more than I'd ever believed. I looked at P, and for the first time, I saw not just a protector, but a partner, a man who had dared to love in a world that offered nothing but cruelty. The baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips, and instinctively, I reached out. P stepped closer, his shadow merging with mine as if the past and future were folding into the same space. "We made it," he said, voice low but steady. "No," I whispered. "We're just beginning." Outside, the wind had softened to a gentle murmur, carrying with it the scent of thawing earth and distant rain. The trees, bare and brittle, held tight to new buds, quiet promises of spring. For the first time in years, I let myself dream. I dreamed of a life where fear didn't rule us, where my children could laugh without looking over their shoulders, where love was not a currency but a gift freely given. I dreamed of planting an orchard by the cabin apple trees that would grow tall and strong, their roots sinking deep into this stubborn earth, just as we had. And as I sat there, with the warmth of my family close, I understood this simple truth. Home is not a place, it is the breath between us. The silent bonds forged in the darkest nights, the hands held tight against the cold, the steady pulse of hearts that refuse to give up. The past will always whisper. It will haunt, it will ache, but it cannot touch what we build here not anymore. Because we have learned the quiet art of resurrection. The baby's fingers curled around mine once more, and I felt the world shift, fragile, fierce, alive. We were no longer just remnants of broken stories. We were the authors of a new beginning. And this time, the story would be ours. If you were in the main character's shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other videos on your screen for more powerful stories.